Um, Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome back to another Saturday webinar. I can see the subtitles are working, which is always nice. As mentioned, as you'll have already heard, I'm joined this week by my colleague and boss, Rohan, for a brand new set of slides with new and exciting information about applications, graphs, offers, that sort of thing. For you to all enjoy today. Rohan, these are new slides to you, so you must be thrilled by the prospect.
Yeah, I've had a sneak peek through them as well, so I'm very excited. I think it's going to be a really good one.
Yeah, just to introduce myself, for those of you who haven't come to the previous 70 of these, my name is Matt. I lead the research team here at UniAdmissions, so my job is to make sure that everything we suggest in these webinars is based in fact and in data, and there's going to be a lot of data in the presentation today. And I work for Rohan, who is one of the founders of UniAdmissions.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Matt said, I'm the founder. So my work is essentially making sure that everything runs smoothly and we continue to improve our success rates year on year, which is kind of the main thing that we're very proud of.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about exam and test data. As I mentioned, a topic very close to my heart. Before next week, we'll be talking about some of the weird and wonderful aspects of the Oxbridge application, some specifics you need to be looking at, and the challenges of these really demanding universities. But we'll be sort of alluding to that throughout in any case. So you'll still be getting useful information today. So we'll be talking about the relative weights of the different parts of the application to start off with. This is something we like to talk about every week. We'll be talking about what the data that I've dug up say about the subject, and we'll be looking at the importance of admissions tests. So some of this will be familiar if you're a regular at these, but hopefully it will all be interesting. And there's some new information that I only put together at what was it, 10:30 this morning, so really fresh off the press, based on data sets that only came about 3 weeks ago. What does matter in the application? First and foremost, you want to be looking at the different weights of the parts of the application. So this is taken from the Oxford PPE manual. And this gives you a sort of a broad sense of how they're kind of ranked. You've got the personal statement at the bottom, the admissions test at the top. But I've never particularly liked this layout, so we tend to use a pie chart, right, Rohan?
Yeah, absolutely.
So traditionally, we've thought of this as being something of the order of the exam grades standing in for about 25% of the score, the admissions tests making up about 40%, about another 30 or so percent for the interview itself, and then 10% or so for the personal statement, the reference, all those little things at the end. But we have found ourselves having to sort of reapproach our sense of how exam grades work over the past couple of years, because well, time for graph number one of the day, because of this, which is that in the last 2 years, the rate at which students receive A star or A in their A levels has almost doubled, which is a big problem for the universities if you're trying to decide which students are the most able, because all of a sudden over 40% of students are getting those A's and A stars, which means that it's much harder to compare when you've got maybe 4 or 5 students per place, and they all have very similar actual A-level records, predicted A-level records. And as we'll see in a second, the same thing applies with Gcses. Rohan, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I think the main thing here is that because it's essentially percentage A stars and A's have doubled, it's very hard for an admissions tutor to essentially be able to distinguish a good candidate from a great one. And that problem is only going to continue for a little bit. So yeah, whilst it's a very difficult thing to apply to Oxford and Cambridge, we do have to have a level of sympathy for the admissions users, which is why the pie chart that we're going to go into is changed quite a bit from what it used to be.
Yeah, and we see the same pattern with GCSEs, where when GCSEs were not, I'm trying to think, around the time I was doing them, only around 16% of GCSEs were awarded an A. They hadn't even invented the A star back in my day. That proportion is now all the way up to nearly 30%. So we're looking at not a million miles off doubling again. It's over a longer time span, but as you can see, most of that change again is happening in the last couple of years with that steep spike. And that means that the GCSEs as well are more difficult to make comparisons using, because you have so many more students who are applying with straight 8s with the occasional 9, straight 9s with the occasional 8. Really, really impressive results that are very hard for the universities to make comparisons using, which is how I've ended up with our adjusted pie chart, which Rohan is going to sort of walk us through a little more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So essentially before we used to say that the GCSEs tests and interviews were essentially equivalent. Whereas now, based on this, what we're finding is actually the test scores in the GCSEs themselves are worth far less than they used to be. And in some cases, they might not be worth anything at all. So we've adjusted this to essentially reflect the fact that the admissions test is by far the most important component of your application, followed by the interview. And then everything else kind of remains unchanged, which is your personal statement, Ucat reference, and the extracurriculars that may be contributing to it. And the GCSEs will very much be taken with a very, very large pinch of salt.
Sorry, this makes kind of intuitive sense, right? The recent circumstances have made it very difficult to hold an exam, but they haven't made it particularly difficult to write a personal statement. So the impact on the personal statement has been much smaller. Now, the advantage of this is, compared with where we were 2 or 3 years ago, where a meaningful amount of your application was baked in at the GCSE stage, you could very much rule yourself out of Oxbridge at that point if you really wanted to. We're now in a position where something in the order of 75%, probably closer to 80 or 85 now, of your chance of getting it is still in your hands. Those GCSE scores, just as them being very high, isn't going to be taken super as the most important thing. Them being a little bit lower also isn't going to be taken as being decisive. That means that you still have a lot of control over what your chances of getting in are, because those GCSEs have fallen in standing relative, particularly to the admissions test. You know, if you can score a spectacular score in an admissions test, then the person making the decision is going to look at that and go, "All right, that's the real information. The stuff in the GCSEs, less convincing." So making sure that you've focused your energy, making sure that you've got your energy focused intelligently, that you know that you're doing the right things, means that you can really take advantage of this this change in the way the application is being assessed. Now, we've sort of talked a little bit about GCSEs and which ones are more important, but this also varies by subject. So there are some GCSEs where you have some subjects where you have very high GCSE scores. For classics, you will routinely have students who have 10 8s and 2 9s. Now, there are reasons for that, not least that applications for classics tend to be centered in the most expensive schools. Those schools tend to sit more GCSEs. Some of those GCSEs may be a little more, they'll be better coached. But there's a lot of variation between the subjects. So there isn't, you would expect there to be a correlation between higher GCSE scores and more competitive subjects, but there really isn't. The GCSE profile for something like law is really quite modest compared to classics, even though the number of students who get into classics is 3 or 4 times as many as those for law. And it just goes to show that the GCSEs, it's not baked in. This isn't the decisive thing for you. So if we sort of flick through a few sample GCSEs, I need to go back and convert these into numbers soon, because the great advantage of the new GCSE system is numbers are much easier to work with. But these are in the old format, because these are still based on the last session that we have proper exams for, because of course the centre assessed grades make this all a little bit trickier. So these are based on students who applied in what would it have been? Would have had their interviews at Christmas 2019. Gosh, what a long time ago. So students applying for natural sciences at Cambridge, the average applicant is going in with 7 A stars, 2 A's and a B. And the average offer holder, the only difference between them and the average applicant at Gcse is they've managed to turn one of those B's into an A star, or rather one of those B's into an A, one of those A's into an A star. You know, depending on your position, that could only be 2 or 3 marks in each of the exams, something really small. We look at engineering, we see pretty much the same thing. It's just a case of getting that one extra bump up. The gap at GCSE between average applicant and average offer holder is still pretty small. Medicine, we see a slightly bigger gap. I think this is because so many more people apply for medicine, right, Rohan, and so many more at the very top end.
Yeah, exactly. To a certain extent, some people just try it just because they're already applying to some very competitive universities. But yeah, that's why. Yeah,
if you don't think you're going to get into UCL, you may as well also not get into Oxford while you're at it, or Cambridge in this case. As we mentioned earlier, for law, the average offer holder, they've got good, but these aren't necessarily spectacular GCSEs, and the average applicant is coming in with as many A's and B's as they have A stars. So we're not talking about completely insane off the wall scores here. Even for a subject like maths, we're looking at students who are still bringing in a B, maybe even 2 or 3. Although I suspect this may be a case of a few students who are very good at maths and really, really working hard for that B in English. So maths may be a little bit of an outlier there. As I've mentioned, this also keys into the competitiveness of the subjects. So some subjects have a huge number of applicants for each place. This is most notably medicine, PPE. There will be computer science, maybe 10 applicants per place. But sometimes there are little sort of nuances here you can exploit. So for some reason, biochemistry is far more popular than traditional chemistry. I've never understood this one. And so you can almost double your chance of getting in by just swapping preference from biochemistry to chemistry. What have people got against chemistry, Rohan?
I suppose it's just biochemistry is just a little bit closer, isn't it, to medicine and sciences. Perhaps chemistry just feels a bit too narrow, perhaps, whereas biochemistry is, well, I can do kind of two sciences. But I mean, biochemistry is even smaller than chemistry, so I'm not sure.
Presumably they you can ask nicely and be allowed to do some of the bio bits, even if you're just doing chemistry.
Less so at Oxford. I mean, Cambridge is very different. So that might be.
That's a good point. Another difference between Oxford and Cambridge are the rates for medical applications. If you want to talk a little bit about this, Rohan, because this is a nuance most people don't know about.
Yeah, so the Cambridge Medical School is larger than the Oxford. It's almost twice the size, actually. And what happens is, broadly speaking, most people don't have a firm idea of whether they should go to Oxford or Cambridge. Oh,
sorry.
Wasn't that astounding, in fact? And as a result of that, we tend to get like roughly a 50-50 split between the number of applicants. But of course, since Cambridge has essentially twice as many places, we tend to see equal number of applicants to Oxford, but essentially double the success rate. So, this is why it's a little bit substantially easier to get into Cambridge. The other major difference is Cambridge will interview more applicants as well. I found out recently, Matt, that one of our school partners that we worked with last year, they got 4 kids into medicine for Cambridge. For internationals, so obviously Cambridge only has about 10 places for internationals.
Oh, wow.
And then we worked with 3 of the students privately. So actually we contributed 70% of Cambridge medical places for internationals. I think that's quite cool.
That's spectacular. We should get some confirmation of that, put it on the website. But as Rohan mentioned here, and this is where we get into some of the new content, the levels of students applying to Oxford and Cambridge has been going up over the last few years. So if we look at the number of applications and the number of offers over the last 5 years, what you see is that the number of people applying has gone up from under 20,000 for Oxford all the way up to very close to 25,000. So an increase of something like 25%, like a really substantial jump there. While the number of offers, as you can see, has remained almost static. I believe there may have been a tiny increase, but we're still talking about well under 5,000 and between 3,500 and 4,000.
It almost looks like it's gone down actually in 2020.
Yeah, so we do see a slight bump up in 2020 and drop down in 2021. And that's as we talked about, God, it would have been back in the summer, because of the students who went through the naughty algorithm process. And so Oxford and Cambridge were very generous in letting pretty much everyone who had an offer in, regardless of what the algorithm had said about their results. And so that did mean a little bit of a squeeze on places the following year. Not as big as we had perhaps predicted, but certainly bigger than the universities themselves were admitting at the time. They denied anything would happen, but the graphs do not lie. All of these, if anyone's interested, are taken directly from the Ucat data platform. Feel free to go and have some fun on there if you like. But it runs in Power BI and it's a little bit fiddly. So I recommend the webinar instead, it's much easier. And we see the exact same pattern for Cambridge as well. Cambridge, for some reason, has a slightly lower number of applicants. I think it must just be the kind of Harry Potter effect. Famously, Harry Potter went to Oxford. And as you can see, while the number of students applying is going up, the number of offers is going down. I think even more noticeably here with Cambridge between 2020 and 2021, you can see a few hundred places being shaved off there, even as there had been modest growth in the number of places available up until that point. So, because these are tall bars, it can be a little bit difficult to see the rate of change. So if we look at the offer rates over time as percentages, we can see that they are declining at almost exactly the same rate, falling from around 25% of students getting into Cambridge and 20% at Oxford, down to closer to 19 at Cambridge and not even 15 at Oxford at this point. We also notice a growing convergence. So where there was a gap of over 5 points between Oxford and Cambridge in 2016, that's shrunk right down to fewer than 5 points, probably close to maybe, I'd say 4 in the last cycle. So that application gap between Oxford and Cambridge is closing, which is all to the good as students are figuring out that Cambridge is perhaps a much nicer place, just better.
Yep. There's no will here to contest that claim.
So that gives us the data for Oxford and Cambridge, but I think it's worth looking at the data for medicine as well, because this is the other really relevant set to be looking at. So as we look at medicine, what we see is that the number of applicants after being fairly stable, 16, 17, 18, we see the beginning of a growth and a big jump in 2021. Something must have happened that made people more interested in medicine. I can't account for it myself. And what we see as well is that the number of reapplicants in 2021 has also really shot up, from close to 3,000 to very close to 5,000. So people just want to be doctors at the moment, and that means that these applications are becoming more and more competitive, because there are at this point fewer than 10,000 places available for medical school, and we're looking at closing on 30,000 people applying for them, and that's 30,000. That's 30,000 people, 10,000 places, and some people.
I think it was even less than 10,000 last year because of all the deferrals from 2020. So I think it's closer to 8.5 or something. Yeah.
So we may be looking at a point where we're looking at a something like a 25% raw chance, and perhaps even lower, because of course you have fewer options in terms of where you can apply. There are some universities that are oversubscribed compared to others. As we learned last week, there's a medical school in Lancaster now, but I imagine that's not quite as popular as UCL or Barts at this point in time.
Yeah. It's interesting how flat that curve is for a few years, and then it really rocks up. Essentially, we start seeing that lift even pre-COVID, don't we?
Yeah, it would be a little bit more of a policy question, but it will be interesting to look into the long run of this, because of course we have broader stagnation in places available during the first part of the 2010s. So if you'd like me to go and get all of the older data, Abraham, we can definitely play around with that, but that may be a little bit ancient history for our audience today.
I feel like you want me to say yes just because you want to do it.
And then just to translate that into the offer rate, what we see is that the offer rate is actually growing as the number of applications stagnates after about 2016, and this is in part a Brexit effect, where you have more places being opened up to counter the exit of non-UK doctors. And then as soon as the pandemic, in fact, before the pandemic hits, we see that offer rate is dropping, and dropping really precipitously over the last couple of years, to the point where we're looking at your chance of having gone from 1 in 4 now to much less than 1 in 5, which is a big drop, right?
Mm. Yeah, that's huge.
And particularly interesting, I think, in this context is the situation around reapplicants. So what we see is a very steady increase in the share of applicants who are reapplicants. So 5 or 6 years ago, only about 10–12% of people who were applying to medicine were doing so for the second time. That number has now increased by more than 50% to over 18%. And if we look at if we pair this curve up with the offer line, what we see is we're very rapidly closing in on a point that there will be more people applying for the second time than there will be people getting in, which is an interesting crossover.
Wow.
Yep.
Essentially, we must have seen second and third year reapplicants at this rate.
Yeah, I have some data on serial reapplication for Oxford and Cambridge only, which I can spin up perhaps during the Q&A for anyone who's interested. But there is a particularly eccentric set of people who do like to apply again and again and again. I'll have a quick look and see if I can get that up for you, in fact, Rohan, when we get to the Q&A bit.
Yeah.
Cool. So that brings us back to sort of the strategy approach to this. So it's getting harder to get in. The good news is we do know how to get in. And to put a long story short, it's admissions tests. Almost every subject at Oxford or Cambridge has admissions test. These will take place for Oxford. Most of these take place I think it's normally the first Wednesday in November for students who are applying to Oxford, and Oxford use these to really narrow down the set of students they're going to interview. Cambridge, some of them they're in advance. Quite a few of them are at interview. I think that's even more this year than previously. And again, these are used to narrow down the selection of students they're going to invite for interview. We only have interview data from Oxford, unfortunately, because Cambridge, because they interview the plurality of students who apply, they don't give us discrete interview data, which is annoying, but you'll see the same patterns are very much there as for Oxford. So if we look at, to take an easy example, the test for physics at Oxford, what we see very quickly and immediately is that the correlation between your score and whether or not you get an offer is incredibly strong. If you are scoring in the bottom half of that distribution, you're not getting to the interview. If you're scoring in the top half, your chance of getting an interview steadily track up until you reach this point around 66–67% score, where you are where you're almost guaranteed to get an interview. And then you get to this point, another 20 points up, where you're odds on to get a place, and then all of a sudden everyone who scores above a certain point in the admissions test is getting a place. So you've kind of your key points here and here, and also down here where people start getting interviews. You get a lovely big spike over here for people who got to the test and were very frightened and didn't do it. And pleasingly, it appears that one person did get an interview, which is nice. They must have had some really good extenuating circumstances. So don't rely on that as your strategy. If we look at the same thing for the MAT, this test for maths, this has a much nicer bunching. So you get a much smoother bell curve. But as you can see, you've got your macro bell curve. I'm just going to draw that on. Whoop, bell curve. And then you have a second nested bell curve in there of whether you get an interview or not, and a third bell curve of whether you get an offer or not. So this is really smooth, very suitable for maths, really good traditional mathematical modeling. Beyond a certain point, you're not going to get an interview. Then your chance of getting an interview go steadily up. And at a certain point, you're pretty much guaranteed to get an interview. And as similarly, your chances of getting an offer go up to the point where you are odds on, or pretty much everyone who gets in the top score is getting an interview. It seems obvious that being good at maths makes them more likely to let you do a maths degree. But I think a lot of students and teachers really underestimate the directness of this connection. It really is a really strong relationship. I haven't sat down and done the R for it to actually measure the correlation, but it's clearly very strong. We see the same thing with the TSA, which is the test for going to study PPE. Again, your chance of getting an interview go up as you get better in the test, and the chance of getting a place as well. And that goes whether it's for the mathematical portion of the TSA or for the verbal reasoning portion of the TSA. You'll notice that students score a little bit higher in the verbal reasoning one, which is one to watch out for. Now, this isn't just the case for the mathematical or the multiple choice exams. Even the admissions tests in the humanities follow this same pattern. So if we look at the ELAT at Oxford, which is the test for studying English, they mark the test with 2 markers, and then they look at that as a guide for interview. And while they'll tell us that they band the students into 4 bands, essentially definitely interview, probably interview, maybe interview, don't interview. We look at the distribution. Again, it's a little wobbly here, but we're still getting the broad traditional curve. What we see is the average applicant on the ELAT gets 42.5, the average interviewee gets 46, and the average offer holder gets nearly 48. So that really smooth transition from getting to the interview and then getting to the offer is there again. And you can see a very smooth relationship with this depending on the competitiveness of the subject. So there's a bigger gap between applicant and interviewee because there are a lot of applicants for English at Oxford, and there's a smaller gap between interviewee and offer holder because they don't interview that many people. But even once you've got to the interview, there's a strong correlation between your performance in the test and your performance in the interview, because the test isn't making a decision at this point. When you're looking at the offer, the interview performance and test performance are very, very highly correlated. So I've talked a lot. I'm going to hand over to Rohan in a moment to talk a little bit about our support. But the takeaways here are your chances of getting an interview are incredibly highly correlated with your performance in the test. Even improving by only a few points can take you from a 10 or 15% chance of an interview to a 20, a 30, 40% chance. Getting from the just above the middle to into the top third, into the top quarter, into the top 20%, you can take yourself from, maybe interview to definitely interview. And the thing to remember is you've got to get the interview if you're going to get in. And so the biggest thing you can do to make sure that you get that interview is to do really well on the admissions test. Additionally, because of the way that things have gone with Gcses over the last several years, these admissions tests are going to be the only thing that the admissions tutors have to work on that allow like-for-like comparisons. It's the only thing that every applicant will have done at the same time, on the same day, the same questions. And so that opportunity for like-for-like comparison is really important. And the other thing to think about here is how you're arranging your time. It's really tempting to spend a lot of time playing around with your personal statement, redrafting it. Once you've got one that's good and you're basically happy with, you can put it to one side. You're going to make a much bigger difference to your chances through the test than you are in the statement. So beyond showing a lot of graphs, there are some other things we can do to help with your application here at UniAdmissions. Rohan, will you tell us about some of them? Well, I know about them. Will you tell everyone else?
Yeah, sure, Matt. So the way we work with students really depends on their situation, but typically we like to work with students over a 12-month period in an ideal setting. And the way we look to do this and to improve our success rates is essentially we select students who are talented, hardworking, and intelligent, and more importantly, committed to their subject, Oxbridge or medical school. And then we really put them through their paces. We've got our own curriculum. So we're not, if you're looking for kind of a cheap tutor or for a short one-day course, we're not the provider for you. The way we work is a much longer period of time. We're essentially a prep school, specifically targeting students applying to these very competitive medical schools and universities. The way things are structured is essentially a 4-tier system, so for 4-segment system. So we've got 4 levels of support, all of which kind of blend together in order to ensure that we get some good results for our students. And the first of these is individual tuition. So the idea of these is when you enroll, you'll typically have anywhere from 30 to 45 hours of one-to-one teaching. It's a huge commitment, as you're probably sensing now. And overall, you can expect to spend about 250 to 300 hours of study time. And of that, at least 30 to 45 hours is spent in a one-to-one setting with someone who's studying your subject at Oxford or Cambridge. And they'll take you through the whole process from personal statement, admissions test, interview, selecting colleges, any additional extra reading and work that's required. At the end of every session, you'll get a lesson report, which then goes out to you and your parents. And then the idea of these is to really kind of stretch you beyond what you're learning in school and ensure that you stay on track. Secondly, we've got access to our online resources and materials. So that's all of our textbooks, that's our prep portal, which essentially has hundreds of questions with work solutions, and in some cases videos to all of these questions. The idea of these is to really give you sufficient practice so that you can actually work in your own time rather than spending in tutorials doing mock papers. Thirdly, we've got intensive courses. So these are essentially 1-day or 1 to 2-day crash courses delivered on weekends. All of our teaching is done online, by the way. And the idea of these is to essentially catch all of our students up. So we'll have courses on Bmat and TSA, all our admissions tests taking place throughout the year. Typically, students will go to about 4 to 6, depending on their subject. And they'll cover essentially personal statement, admissions test, and interview. And then finally, we've got our enrichment seminars. And these are essentially tutorials designed to stretch students beyond what they're learning about in school. They happen every week on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And essentially they're designed to teach you things that you won't cover at school, so that when you get to the interview setting and they say, what are you interested in, or what have you read recently, you've got a huge depth and breadth of material that you can really impress your tutors with. And all of this, does it work? Well, the idea of all of this is essentially it builds together, and if we do what we set out to do and you commit to us as well, then we see some pretty impressive results. So with Oxbridge, we get almost more than half, almost 2/3 of our kids into Oxbridge. With medics, we get more than 80% in. So what we do does work, but it is a big financial investment. More importantly, it's a time investment as well. And we need that commitment from both sides.
Yeah, as Rohan says, for us, it isn't about whether you've got spectacular GCSE grades. As long as you are in the ballpark, if you've got a couple of A stars, a few A's, a B, maybe even 2, that's fine. We're much more interested in whether you have the right attitude, whether you have the potential, than what you've achieved so far. It wouldn't make sense to make a judgment on someone based on what they had done when they were 14 or 15. 14 and 15-year-olds, things change. We're much more interested in a student who has found their passion, found their motivation, rather than someone who has been coasting along because they're good but lazy. Going to a top university is much more about your passion, your enthusiasm, your commitment, it's as much about that as it is about your ability, because that's what allows you to develop your ability. And so, our approach is all about making sure that we unlock the potential in there, rather than picking up a student who is gonna, isn't going to really try, because that's frustrating for us to work with. It's frustrating for our tutors, and it's frustrating for the students as well. We're much happier and much prouder of taking on students who we can develop than students who are already there, or who, worst case, as we encounter a lot, who think they're already there but are mistaken and are unwilling to put the work in. So that brings us to sort of the end of the slides part of this. We're being joined, I believe, by one of our former students today, Rohan, right? Or are they a tutor, or are they both?
Yeah, I think they're a former student.
Exciting. So they're going to be joining us for a Q&A in a moment. If you've enjoyed this webinar, please take a look on Trustpilot, leave a nice review, particularly about me, and take a look at the feedback we've had from other people who have worked with us in the last few months and years. It's much clearer, much more trustworthy coming from them than from me. They don't have a vested interest. So we'll move on to some questions, I think. If you have a detailed question that's about your personal circumstances, please do book in a consultation with us. That gives you the chance to have a proper conversation, ask detailed questions about what you are interested in, and also gives us the chance to do a little bit more research to really understand your situation. I know that I don't know if Rohan, are you doing consultations this weekend, or is it just Simone? Or
I think, yeah, we're getting pretty hammered with lots of students keen, so I think it'll probably be a team effort this weekend. So yeah, if you're lucky, you may even get me on the flash. Flash unlucky, depending on how keen you are. Right, we've got a couple of questions coming in. Do you prepare people for Bmat? Yes, we've got lots of books on the Bmat, which I wrote a long time ago, and they are updated. And I'm sure Matt's gone through them many times himself.
Oh yes, I had a marvelous experience reading Rohan's Bmat book. 600 pages A4, 11-point type. Took me 3 days, and there weren't even that many typos. It wasn't even that satisfying.
Yeah, we do prepare for Bmat. That's kind of medicine is one of our most popular subjects. So yes, that is very much what we do.
Yeah.
How early should you start preparing for the admissions tests? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Firstly, it depends on the test. If you're planning on taking something like the TSA or the ELAT, these are softer skills and they will take a longer period of time. If you're doing something like the NSAA, then to a certain extent you can do intensive preparation. We tend to say, and again, it depends hugely on the test. If it's a knowledge-heavy test, then you really don't need to be spending fractions of a year. Normally a few months is sufficient. Whereas if it's a skills test like the ELAT or the TSA, then several months, probably 6+ to kind of really get started. The best students will really start doing 12 months prep. Okay. I'm studying for the TSA. I will enroll for the course today. Should I start preparing for using Bmat section 1 and save the TSA papers for later in the year?
Oh, a smart, knowledgeable question. Someone who's figured out how these tests work.
What do you think, Matt?
I don't think it's all that bad an idea, actually. They are very similar in style, and there are other places you can look for additional verbal and numerical reasoning questions. We have a huge database of thousands of them that we have, but there are other places as well. If you apply for a job at the civil service, for example, they have loads of these types of tests built in, and so you can practice on those as well. But I think preparing using Bmat section 1 is a good idea. You have got a longer archive of Bmats, but make sure that you're taking a close look at the differences between the tests as well, just to make sure you're not practicing something that isn't going to come up. But that's a very cunning approach. I like it a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great idea. and highly recommended. So yes, I would start off by doing the TSA papers, not under timed conditions, then start doing them under timed conditions, and then that gives you sufficient BMAT papers. BMAT papers, and then that gives you sufficient TSA papers to be kind of practicing in timed conditions later in the year. The other thing to say while we're on that is try and do every single test paper for your subject at least twice before the actual test.
Yeah. The past papers, as always, are the best resource for figuring out what you need to do. Joshua asks about how far in advance you should start practicing for the test.
Well, we've kind of covered this. The 3 months and the 6 months is broadly, again, depends on the test, but if it's skills based, several months, ideally 12. If it's knowledge based, then you can get away with far less, a few months.
Cool. And Maria asks about scholarships. Rohan, I think we skipped past the slide about the foundation this week. So if you want to talk a little bit about the support we offer there.
Yeah. So every year we have something called the UniAdmissions Foundation. This is essentially a way for students from underprivileged backgrounds who don't have the means to support, to finance for our support. What we do is essentially we try and get to as many students as we possibly can. Our target this year is 300 to 400 students. So essentially, typically last year, the number of places we were able to field and the number of students we were able to support was actually restricted by the number of people applying rather than by our capacity. So if you are interested in working with us, then please don't let money be an issue, because we will help students completely for free in many cases, if the motivation and desire and the aptitude is there. So in answer to your question, that yes, there are essentially scholarships or bursaries available, and the maximum will be 100%.
Lovely. Yeah, can't do more than 100%, otherwise we'd be paying you.
Yeah.
Which, of course, if you do well and you get in and you want to come back and be a tutor with us the following year, I guess we could do.
Yeah, which a few people do, in fairness. So.
We have a question about the Cambridge test of mathematics for university admissions, particularly for computer science. Rohan, I don't know anything about maths, which is dangerous given all these graphs I've made, because the CTMUA is much harder than the stuff I do in Excel. We'll be preparing students for that specifically, right?
Yeah, so the CTMA will typically be doing courses over the summer, but there'll also be courses closer to the test date as well. Typically, you can expect 2 to 3 days of intensive courses, and obviously your tutorials and general resources and books. So yes, there's a huge amount of work that goes on. It's not just, and the other thing to mention is it's not just a TMUA for computer science. Now, TMU is also needed for economics.
Yeah. It's worth noting here, as well as Rohan says, the TMUA coming in for economics and computer science at Cambridge are two of the most competitive subjects. I'm just going to quickly fact check myself, but yeah, if we're looking at Cambridge, economics is just shy of 15% of people getting an offer, and computer science is lower again at close to 10%. So the impact you can have on your application with really good preparation for the test there is going to be really big, because the competition is really high, and so that correlation between the performance in the test and the chance of getting in is going to be really important for your chances. So yeah, if that's what you're going for, I really recommend making sure that you're well prepared, because it's a difficult test, the TMUA, and it's also very competitive. Cool. We've sort of barreled through those at quite a pace, Rohan.
Yeah, we should slow down and take our time. Well, we've got one more which says the fee structure for medicine. So I assume you mean the university fees. Home students will typically be looking at £9,000 a year. Internationals can be much higher. Well, it will be much higher if you're international. So anywhere from £27,000 to £60,000 a year. So it is a substantial and serious cash investment. So yes, if you are applying internationally for Oxford Medicine or just generally medical schools in the UK, then you will need to be very secure financially, and because the universities will ask for proof of funds.
Yeah. And the thing to note there, though, for home students is that £9,500, that's not money you're paying up front. That's money you pay through the student loan system.
Yes.
And so you will never actually need to have that money. All you'll need to do is be able to pay it back through the tax system when you've become a doctor. And you know, that's fine. So while it is expensive on the ticket, it is free up front, so to speak. You're not going to start repaying that until you have become an actual doctor and are making enough money to afford it. So it sounds a little scary, but if, like me, you've been to university and now are paying it back, there's something surprisingly pleasing about how little it is. I think I paid £30 a month. It's if they'd told me that beforehand, I think it would have been a much easier decision. So whenever they say 9,500, just remember that what they mean is £50 a month.
Yeah, absolutely. But how would you guys recommend to improve my problem-solving skills in the TSA? Oh, good question.
Ooh. So the problem-solving section of the TSA is all about figuring out what the mathematical question that's been hidden in the words is. There will be normally not especially complicated piece of math, some simultaneous equations, a little bit of algebraic substitution. But the difficult part, at least in my experience, is that it is hidden in a lot of sometimes difficult to follow English. And so I'd say that the thing to do is to take the questions very slowly at first and really try to understand the relationships between the words and the quantities, and to really take your time mapping it all out. And perhaps, working on a vocabulary list to help you deal with the vocabulary challenges. So that you can understand, faster and faster as you practice, what the questions are actually asking you, because the maths in these will invariably be pretty easy. It'll all be whole numbers. You won't need a calculator. The maths itself is normally something that a 12-year-old can do. It's the fiddly part is figuring out what the question actually is.
Essentially it's translating the problem into mathematical equation, which is actually the problem solving of it. And then once we've done that, it's actually fairly straightforward from there on. Yeah.
So I would practice turning the language into algebra. Do it really slowly and deliberately at first, but also put together that little vocabulary list that helps you identify how the questions are structured, so that you can sort of understand the formula of them a little bit better. You get a lot of questions about area, about prices, about time. Practice understanding how the language there translates into the maths so that you can do it quickly, because as Rohan says, the maths itself is normally pretty easy once you get there. And this is a good general tip actually for the TSA, for the Bmat, for a lot of the admissions tests. If you're not allowed a calculator, it's because you don't need one. If you come up with an answer that suggests, if you find that you need a calculator to get to the answer, probably you've done something wrong, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good rule. Is if you find yourself requiring to do calculus or something that requires differential equations or has several decimal places, you're probably going down the wrong path very quickly.
Yeah, it's very unlikely that you'll be given a question that needs a calculator without a calculator.
Yeah.
We have a question about the Ucat. We didn't talk very much about medicine at all this week. If you are interested in talking about medicine tests, we have on the website, I believe, an archived one of these all about those. So do go back and enjoy that if you're interested in a deep dive on medicine tests. But Rohan, tell us about the Ucat, because the Ucat is an unusual exam.
It is an unusual exam, and it's required by a lot of medical schools. It's like the slightly more popular version of the Bmat. It's a computer-based test. It's 5 sections done over 2 hours. And interestingly, you get your results on the same day, which is quite odd for as far as admissions tests go. But and again, test skills rather than knowledge. And yes, it can and should be prepared for ultimately. So yes, you can just get away with just doing the Ucat. You can actually apply to medicine just doing the Bmat. Our advice is normally to take both. But again, we need to speak to you and get a better understanding of what your aims are before we kind of make a recommendation.
Yeah. The Ucat is very different from the Bmat, so it is worth making sure that you have a little bit of explore with it. They are different exams. The Ucat is much stranger, much more abstract. The Bmat, it asks you a question about science, whereas the Ucat will ask you questions about shapes. So if you find that you really don't get on with one or the other, it can be worth focusing on one of the two. But like Rohan says, you don't want to rule yourself out of a bunch of medical schools because you don't want to do the Ucat. And again, because it's so weird and difficult to revise for, the return to investment on being well prepared for it is really high. You probably won't have practiced that shape stuff before, and so the improvements you can make there are bigger than you're going to be able to make in GCSE science, perhaps.
Yeah.
And we have a question about reapplications. Reapplications for computer science in particular. Oh, it's over in the chat, Rohan.
So if I don't get into Cambridge for computer science this year, will I be disadvantaged if I apply again for computer science again next year to Cambridge again, but a different college? Well, I think this is fairly straightforward, which is I don't see any reason why you would be disadvantaged if you're reapplying. I think if you're applying to the same college, it's not something we'd recommend for applying. I mean, we've not done reapplications for a while, but essentially, if you are reapplying, there's pretty good evidence that shows that you are more likely to be successful as a second time than a first time applicant. So no, you won't be disadvantaged. If any, again, as long as you can justify why you're reapplying and what the importance of that is, and what went wrong the first time and what you've learned, then no, it shouldn't make a big difference. I feel that once I have A-levels under my belt and apply next year, I'll have a much more time to prepare for the TMUA and do lots of super curricular things. But does this mean Cambridge will not give me weightage as someone applying first time? No, not really. That's not how it works. Although if it sounds like, again, we need to speak to you to kind of figure this out a little bit more, but it sounds like you've not had either you've not applied or you're setting yourself potentially up for failure. So it's good to go in with a positive mindset. And if you'd like to kind of discuss things more, then please do just get in touch with us.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the computer science reapplication information I've got. So if you want to talk a little bit about the IB for a second while I get a number for our lovely attendee.
Yeah, okay. So admissions to Oxbridge really depends on, well, the IB grades you need will depend on whether you're applying to Oxford or Cambridge, just to start with. So whoever's just put that question, Marcos, can you just clarify? It sounds like you're looking for Oxford, but it'd just be useful to double check. Normally okay, brilliant, yeah, it is Oxford. So normally in A levels you need an A star with 2 A's. IB tends to be around 38 points in most cases, but again, it depends on exactly which subjects you're doing. Okay, any other questions? Matt, how are you doing on the reapplicant?
I've got a number. So in 2019, the success rate for students applying for computer science in general was 10.3%. But for students who were applying for the second time in that same year, it was 16%. So there's a definite uptick if you're applying for the second time. For obvious reasons, more people reapply for the more competitive subjects. But it does look as though in the case of computer science, it makes a really substantial difference. In 2019, in fact, let me just see. Yeah, we're looking at nearly 25% of students getting in on that basis in 2018. So the long run average is really positive for reapplying for computer science. So I think that's an eminently sensible idea. And applying the first time but not getting in, but having had the practice, having had the experience, that really puts you in good stead to come back the following year.
Yeah.
There was also a question about, I think it was probably a question from us, about people who reapply again and again and again. So as a kind of humorous note to end on then, Rohan, how many people do you think reapply each year? How many reapplicants do you think there were last year? So people reapplying for the first time.
To Oxford and Cambridge?
I've just got the Cambridge data in front of me.
Cambridge. And then I think we said, what, 15,000, 20,000 applicants to Cambridge normally? Yeah. What do we, I think probably about 1,500, 10% would probably be fair.
Yeah, so I've got a touch lower than that because, of course, we can't track which ones are coming over from Oxford. The number I've got is 870.
Okay, so 5%, just over 5%.
Yeah, and then we expect to add, a similar number again from people who are sort of defecting from Oxford.
Yeah, which is actually really common. So
yeah. But more interestingly, we have a further 25 people who are reapplying for the second time. So this is their third attempt. 7 people who are on their 4th attempt.
Wow.
2 people on their 5th, and 3 people on their 6th attempt.
Oh, that is serious commitment, isn't it? 6 times.
Yep. And you will not be shocked to learn that the more you apply, the less it works.
Beyond the second time, I assume.
Yeah, so the first, doing it again gets you in about a third of the time. Doing it for a third time still works fairly well, but after that it really drops off. And believe it or not, that person who was applying for the sixth year in a row did not get in.
Oh, no.
I mean, they might
feel like they're doing something probably fundamentally wrong at that point.
Yeah. My question is, did they get in any of those times, or were they on some kind of slightly eccentric plan where they insisted on getting in several years in a row before they'd do it? But we do have, I'm just looking through these, in 2020, no, the most, 4 times is the most I can see anyone having succeeded after. So 4 attempts for someone who tried in 15 and 16 and 17, but then in 2018 they got in, but only 1 person.
Wow. Well, there you go.
So don't be that insistent. I think that brings us to the end after that slightly silly conclusion. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's been lovely to see you, Rohan. Lovely to see all of the smiling faces, metaphorically speaking, on the other side of the screen. Thank you to everyone who has left us who's given us a question. Thank you for everyone who has stayed for the whole thing. And thank you in advance to anyone who leaves a lovely review on Trustpilot about my wonderful graphs. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time to talk about, I don't know what we're doing, but I'm looking forward to it, whatever it is.
Thanks, man. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.